Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier, or in this case, Brattleboro, shakes out for the rest of us. I want to welcome Leah McGrath Goodman. As you can see, we both get to be here on the Zoom today in the same place at the same time. It's always exciting. I've had Leah on the show before, but if you haven't met Leah, she is an investigative journalist and is currently working and about to finish, drum roll, her master's in corruption from the University of Sussex in England. And the last time on your show we talked about corruption, which was a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. But this time we're going to talk about crime data.
Yes, and I should add, since we're trying to offer bona fides for me, I've done a lot of work writing about financial issues in communities both big and small, and working at Newsweek in particular. I did a whole bunch of studies on small towns and how they deal with big problems. Especially economically, but of course that affects everything else.
Yeah, that touches everything.
Yeah.
Well, fantastic. Thank you, Leah, for being here today. And folks, if you haven't seen, I will include it in the show notes. We're going to be referencing heavily a meeting that happened at the Brattleboro Selectboard on August 20th. And it's a meeting where they did a deep dive into some of the crime statistics and crime data for the town of Brattleboro. And it was looking, what brought it to the select board is the Brattleboro Police Department is diving into data. It's getting much more into data collecting. And there's a memo in that particular select board packet from Chief Hardy talking about how they're hoping to share this data down the road with service agencies in Brattleboro, so to kind of help coordinate some of the need and response to need in Brattleboro. The data came from a group called the Crime Research Group, CRG, and they are a nonprofit in Vermont. They were founded, I think, in 2014, thereabout. And that's what they do. They take public safety data, they take crime data, and they analyze it. And I highly recommend people check out their website, because they do have some reports on their website that are pretty interesting. I could not hear everyone's name clearly over Zoom, so if I mispronounce anyone's name, I apologize, but the folks from the Crime Research Group who joined the meeting was Monica, I heard Weaver and Weber, and I couldn't confirm that. So
the sound on the presentation by CRG was pretty
it was pretty rough.
Yeah, and don't ask me what the names are now because I'm not going to remember them.
So Monica Weaver or Weber, so if I got that wrong, I apologize, Monica. She's the executive director. And then Dr. Robin Joy also joined. And then on the Brattleboro side, Chief Hardy and Assistant Police Chief Jeremy Evans were also participating in the conversation. I think I will give a very high view of some of what they talked about. What the presentation did was it looked at calls to the police department from 2022 to August 2024. And then they broke it down, like what type of calls they received, were there, and there was geographical hotspots of where a lot of these calls came from. And then were there, this is awful, were there kind of repeat customers? I was going to say repeat customers, but yeah, people who some people, they called the police department multiple times in one day, or the police interacted with the same person multiple times in one day, and they broke that down as well. And I think for this conversation, what is probably the most important is the overwhelming number of calls that the department receives fell into what's Dr. Robin Joy categorized as disorder. So trespass, someone calling saying, I don't know, there's a suspicious person
Mhm.
on my street, or property crime that wasn't or what could have been property crime but turned out not to be
Mm.
vandalism or anything like that.
Yeah.
So things that were, I would characterize, Leah, more as like quality of life, people feeling unsafe, people feeling uncomfortable.
Mhm. And
Um,
they want, very importantly, the meeting said that these were things social services really were, rather than police, probably more fitting to
right.
address.
And I think, just for historical context, I will remind listeners that Chief Hardy's predecessor, I don't know if you
Mhm.
remember Chief Mike
Mhm.
Fitzgerald.
I
Yeah,
do. I do.
he started on this issue a long time ago, saying we can't arrest our way out of some of these problems. That
Yeah.
this is a social service need. This is a police need. Where we gotta kind of figure this out.
Yes.
I think it was under police, Chief Fitzgerald, where is it HCRS has a embedded social worker at the police department?
I do not know the details of what the social services are doing for
Right.
that, but yeah.
But they do have one or two people at the police department who goes on some calls if they suspect it's a social service need.
Hmm.
Um,
I mean, that would make sense if there were people who could help, and also like trauma informed people who can help. You know,
mhm,
a police officer may not be a, if there's a crime, a police officer might be good, but
mhm,
yeah, I think that they found that by and large, they were finding that the data were showing this was what was later described as disorderly conduct. So it could just be tussles and scuffles, suspicious people, suspicious behavior, or just like probably some people call over just noise, right? Like just a noise
a
issue,
noise
like
complaint.
somebody setting off firecracker. You know, there
Mhm,
can be lots of reasons to do it, but they were trying to differentiate disorder from more serious crimes. And they found that about a third of a lot of these things came down to like things related to drugs and alcohol or other substance misuse. Um, and they also found that there was a 16% rise overall in the last 3 years in police dispatch calls, but the smaller amount of it was for serious crime. But they did say also serious crime has gone up.
hmm,
So even though it's a smaller proportion, you know, I think they even said, you know, the really serious stuff was no more than 1%, but it was still going up. And so I think that there's a lot to be said about, you know, are we doing what we need to be doing in our community to be helping people properly? And do we
mhm,
have the safeguards in place
mhm,
and the infrastructure in place? Which it sounds like the top 20, which I know you're going to want to talk about,
mhm.
the data identified a top 20 group of people who represented the largest amount, you know, by 20 people of calls. I think it was 1,700 calls were represented by the top 20 people, and that was roughly 6% of the total. So they were finding a small number of people were disproportionately needing police
Mhm.
and ultimately mainly social services, but it was the police being called
Right.
and trying to find out, well, what do we do about those in the most need? And what they found when they looked at the names of the top 20 people, which have not been publicly, they've not been publicly released to residents of Brattleboro and the area, but what they found was one of the top 20 was circulating between Bennington, Springfield, and Brattleboro and was traveling. And so it was affecting other towns.
Mhm,
And the other thing they found was in the top 20 that there were, I think they said that most of them had been subjected to what were called no trespass orders by most of the social services agencies.
hmm,
There was one person who'd actually been more or less not allowed in 19 different locations and
mhm.
service agency provisions. So,
Yeah.
you know, can't go to groundworks, for example. And so what they found was that the people in the highest need actually weren't even allowed to access services anymore in a lot of places. And that was in a follow-up article that came out
Mm,
in
okay.
Vermont Digger, by the way, that wasn't mentioned at the meeting.
Okay. Yeah.
But that
Thank you
was
for
in
that.
Vermont Digger as a follow-up that this was an issue. What do we do about the no trespass orders? Because what
Mm,
VTDigger pointed out was the people causing some of the most calls or in the most need and leading to the most disorder are actually slipping through their cracks because our social services agencies have decided not to provide for them. and that they are subject to no trespass orders. Almost all of them are, apparently. So they're
Mhm.
trying to decide, well, what do we do about those groups of people? If they're causing this level of disturbance and yet they're in clearly deep need, but they're not necessarily easy to engage with. Not that anybody's easy to engage with, but that it's much more difficult and some of the agencies have given up.
I wouldn't use the phrase given up. I would use the phrase that probably there had been some interactions and behavior that the social service agencies felt were either too disruptive or dangerous for their staff and clients.
Yes, yes.
Um, and
Well,
because I
meaning
don't think they hand
meaning
those out
they,
those trespass orders lightly.
yeah, given up not to be given untoward weight, but given up meaning we cannot deal with this person anymore
Mhm.
because they represent too high of a risk. So, they are washing their hands of those people, not because they mean them any ill intent, but because we've had, it was cited also in this VTDigger story that since the killing of one of the service workers
Mhm.
for groundworks, which was really traumatizing for everyone.
Yeah.
That person's now on trial for first degree murder because we lost someone in our agencies. And I think that there was a feeling of, if we need to use no trespass orders according to this article, then we will, because we can't have our workers in a line of danger that is more than they can handle or more than we as a community can handle.
Mhm.
What's happening is those people are then just sent to, be in the community without anybody,
Without services.
yeah, without
Right.
any guardrails, which means everyone's sort of dealing with it at that point.
Mm.
That's not necessarily safer.
Right. But then at that point, who's the right person to help?
Right. And the article further said that while police and providers are aware of the people who are falling through their cracks, they have been talking about it and still have not come to a solution about what to do with the people who are in the deepest need.
Mhm. Mhm. But whose behavior may have reached an unsafe level for other people.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. What do we do about that as a
Mhm.
community? So I think that that is one of the things, you'll see it characterized in our media and in our meetings as difficult questions, difficult conversations. You'll see a lot of references to that,
Mhm.
but you won't necessarily see a solution. And I think that that's maybe giving a lot of people pause right
Hmm.
now.
Well, CRG? Yes. CRG did say that they would provide some recommendations, I believe I heard
Yes,
in the meeting. So,
yes, yes.
you know, bated breath. And I don't know about you, Leah, but I really appreciated CRG's presentation. And even though we might still be sitting with, well, what's next? What I appreciated the most is, and many people probably know this, but crime data can be a little tricky sometimes because not every organization collects the same data the same way.
That's true.
And so, like, I remember reading an article from the Pointer Institute on mass shootings,
Mhm.
and I don't remember all the numbers exactly, but they said, in 1 year, the US had either like 1,000 mass shootings or 10,
Mhm.
depending on what data you looked at and
Yes,
whose definition you were using.
yes,
And we would all like to think that on something that serious, we had some common data and some common understanding, but so often we don't. And so I just felt really excited for the social service agencies, the town, and the police department to have some good data that was broken down in a way that even if we don't know what we're going to do now, it feels actionable.
yeah, yeah,
It feels like, okay, now we can kind of see where people are feeling uncomfortable, where incidents are happening the most,
yeah.
and who maybe needs help first.
Yeah, and how to prioritize our resources because we are a small town. For those who are, I don't know how many people are listening from Brattleboro. We are, and how many are from elsewhere, but we're a 12,000 give or take person town.
Yeah.
It's been pretty much around 12,000 for a long time. Some people say 13,000, but 12,000 seems to be sort of the agreed upon general level. So we can't necessarily take on the world, right?
Right.
We do need to delineate what we're able to do well, and then maybe areas where we're not going to be as able to handle something, and where we might need help, or even to work with places elsewhere to give us support.
Yep. The other thing I found interesting about this data is um, CRG also broke down incidents and
Mm,
arrests, and
yeah,
not every call
yeah,
led to an arrest because it wasn't necessarily a crime.
yeah,
And I think that's an important thing for people to in the community specifically to understand that I think sometimes we can look, we call the police and we have it in our heads that if you call the police, there's going to be an arrest.
yeah, yeah,
And when there isn't one, I think people can feel like, well, nothing's happening. The police aren't doing anything. And it may be because it wasn't technically a crime.
yeah,
It may be because this is a social service issue and that's where we need to focus on.
mhm,
Um, but I appreciated that data because it does remind people that we're in some sticky wickets with
yeah, very,
trying to figure out how to help people and what they need. And one thing I like about the 911 system
mhm.
is it is very easy if someone's in a crisis or very scared, they got one number to call. And
It's
then
only three digits.
yeah, it's three
You got to
digits.
do it fast.
And
3 digits.
then, dispatch can decide where that needs to go. And I think on that
Yeah,
side, that's a very efficient
yeah,
thing. And I guess part of my hope too is that down the line we can find maybe if we, to still keep that kind of efficiency. It's like at the other end
mhm,
that people really need help. The police need help, the social service agencies need help in the
yeah,
response side.
yes. Well, I'll play devil's advocate a little bit here because that's what I do. If most of this is social services support needs going on, that the bulk of the police calls are really actually for things that social services would possibly.
Mhm.
This is what the meeting was saying at the select board level was social services might be better able to handle more of these things. What we're dealing with right now is a situation where police might be getting calls for a thing that wouldn't necessarily be a crime, and yet they are being overtaxed by these requests and calls and
Right.
dispatches, which definitely, if you only have so many police officers, you meet so many places at once. So from a what is the impact on the community perspective, we're dealing with something where the impact on the community can mean that our police services are being hamstrung in some ways by these needs because they're the ones who end up having to go to the front line.
Mhm.
And I think that that's, something we have to really think about is if we're paying for police
Right.
services, do we want the main thing that they're doing to be supporting our social services agency,
No, and I
or
think
do we
that
want
was
them to do policing?
no, that was very clear in the meeting, and I think what I did was I jumped ahead. So, to me, it's like, "Okay, what's the system change here?"
Yeah,
And Chief Hardy is talking about how we can collaborate better with the social services, and in my head,
yeah,
it's like, "Okay, well, let's keep 911, but let's add a branch
yeah,
where, there can those calls that sound more like social services can be funneled a different way,
hmm,
rather than either right to the police department or maybe
yeah,
there's becomes a new, like, joint task force
right, right,
that is social services and police, so if you
yeah,
show up and there is a crime happening,
yeah.
um,
I mean,
you have, like, a dual response, like,
yeah.
that's where I was going with the 911 thing.
Well, right. And there also could just be something simply where if you call 911 and you say that you have a need and it's clearly more social services related,
Mhm.
I think the police could also potentially, by the way, I do not know what they are doing in this area or if they're already doing it. But, if I'm a dispatcher, I might say, ma'am, why don't you call Turning Point in the morning? Why don't you call Groundworks? They have somebody on the team or somebody from
Mhm.
HCRS can call you back. You know, but I think the idea that the police have to always
Right.
run out when maybe they needed somewhere else, I think that's a little bit tricky. And also as a community, we need to be deciding, do we have the ability, infrastructure, and capacity as a 12,000 person community to have a whole separate kind of 911 just for social services?
Mhm.
Um, have we already started this conversation of, are we biting off more than we can chew for the size of our community? I go back constantly to the idea of, remember the size of our community, remember the size of our tax base, remember that everyone is trying to be here as peacefully and happily as possible. And in all my time in Brattleboro, which is now over a decade, I've never seen somebody being unkind to someone in need. I've
Mhm.
never seen someone, I've never seen people not treat those in need in our community with anything other than kindness. And that, a mutual kindness goes a long way when we might not be able to do everything we want to do for people. We can coexist peacefully together. We can encourage coexisting peacefully together.
Mhm.
I know you've done things for people. I have too. It's not always that you can go buy food for every single person in need, but you might occasionally be buying food for people in need. And
Mhm.
I think if as a community we're conveying to those in need that we do care in our day-to-day behavior toward them, I think that matters versus making people feel unwanted, uncared about, or dehumanized. And I do think our community is good at that. um, I think we need to take some credit for being good at it and not be worried that we're not doing that, because I really think we are. I think a
Mhm.
lot of us have done that. And I know that some people privately complain, but I don't think they would dare be unkind
Right.
anywhere anyone could witness it, because this community does not believe in that. It
Mhm.
believes in being kind to those in need. I love that about Brattleboro. I love that our heart is almost too big to contain our hearts, because
Mhm.
we want to do more. We always want to do more, and we want to do the best we can.
Mhm.
So I think the data is so important to be like, are we doing our best? Could the resources we have be directed in a way that could help more people, or be more effective?
Yeah. Well, one thing that the data also says to me is it, or at least it echoes to me a bigger issue, two big issues that I see. And this is Olga's little universe. Two things. One, the fact that right now, our system for the most part, not exclusively,
Mhm.
because the Brattleboro Police Department and social service agencies have done some work around responding and how they respond, um, and not treating everything like a crime.
Yeah.
Um, is, you know, the fact that the police are usually the first one called signals to me that so much of our social services, our human services, whatever you want to call them,
Mhm.
the systems are set up that they don't catch people until they're really in crisis.
Mhm. Yes.
If we were
Yeah.
trying to catch people sooner, I think we would have already figured out how to dispatch
Yes.
social service agencies
Yes.
rather than the police.
And by the way, we mean catch, like catch them before they fall. We don't mean catch them like,
Right, like,
yeah.
and put them in jail.
Yeah, we mean like help them up before they get too far down.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, our social service net kicks in really deep when someone's deep into crisis
Yes.
before, and there are some exceptions, like Sevka has a rental, um, support system that tries to keep people, if they're in danger of losing their housing, to keep them in their housing before
Yeah.
they lose it, because it's less expensive and less traumatic to keep someone in housing
Right.
than for them to become unhoused and then have to,
Yes.
get back over that hurdle. Um, but this is a question I have for Brattleboro in general is, you know, Brattleboro wants to be a helping community,
Mhm.
which yay. And it does have, the retreat has had a long presence in Brattleboro as a helping place.
Mhm.
Um, we have I think, a community ethos that wants to be a helping place.
Mhm.
Um, and we have a lot of social service agencies that also want to be helping places.
Yeah.
So it's like part of our identity, but sometimes I feel like we're kind of, as a community, like on the fence with that identity. Like sometimes I feel probably in moments of frustration having sat through many meetings like the Brattleboro Selectboard meeting on the 20th, it's like, okay, Brattleboro, are you either going to just really lean in
Yeah.
and say, okay, we are the helping community. And if that's the case, like if that's truly going to be the core of our identity as a community, then it means that we have a lot of gaps in the system that need to be filled.
Yes.
Like, for example, with the retreat, um, I have spoken with folks at the retreat and they feel frustrated that there isn't a lot of transitional housing. So someone's come to the retreat for treatment and they're still in that place where maybe they don't need that intensive inpatient treatment anymore.
Yeah.
But they still need outpatient or they still need services of some sort. And there's no housing for them in that in-between place.
Right.
So I feel if as a community we were really deeply leaning into this identity, we'd fill some of these gaps better than we are.
Yeah.
And we'd be saying, hey, state, if we're the helping community, help us fill these gaps a little bit more.
Yeah.
Wait. So those are kind of the two things that I'm sitting with.
Yeah, sorry, I thought you were going to move on to a new thing, so I was going to jump in on what you were saying about that. I think the reason there's a perception we're on the fence, if I may, I know I do know it has to do with there are splits in the attitudes. Like some people really want to do this, and some people are like, it's gone too far. We can't go this far. But let's setting aside that because I don't even know how we would quantify our perception of who really wants to be a part of being a recovery town and who doesn't. And also because our town is so committed as a wider community to the idea of being a helping town that I think people, even if they wanted to say, hey, I don't want to do that anymore, I want us to be about something else. I don't think they'd want to say that publicly. I don't feel that way personally, just to, so the audience is like, where is she coming from though? I do think we should be a helping town, but like Olga said, how do we define how much help and what success looks like? Is success, we help at least 20 people a year get from deepest need to they're in a housing situation with a job or at least with some level of support where they can maybe move toward taking care of themselves and their families or themselves and others? Or is it just, sort of this idea of like a spot aid, like spot check at various crisis stages? Is that what we want to do well? What are we trying to do well? And what does it mean to do it well? And I think that the split you're seeing is the economics piece, because even though we don't want to say it, this stuff does cost money. And we don't live in a community that has enough people who can financially support all of these goals because our actual underlying economics, where we see housing prices just kind of skyrocketing, but job wages potentially stagnating, our economy is actually shrinking. And please, if anyone has data that shows our economy is growing, please send it to me. Either find Olga or I'll leave my email in the notes. But from what I can see,
the Montpelier happy hour at gmail.com.
Yes.
Easy peasy.
If you see growth in our economy, even if it's just a sector of our economy here in Windham County or just Southern Vermont or Brattleboro specifically, please send it, because right now what I'm seeing is a shrinking economy, but our goals continuing to sort of balloon. But these things are expensive. Housing here is incredibly expensive versus what people earn. The median income being like
I paid
under
less for
40,000 a
housing.
year.
Yeah, I paid less for housing in London than I paid for housing here.
Yeah, like our median income is, I think,
in ratio to my wages, I should clarify.
Right. It's under 50,000 a year. And last I checked, it was like high 30s, around $40,000 a year. So if you want to get a house in Brattleboro, even an apartment, and you're planning on paying your utilities on time or any of the other things, taxes, it's not possible. So the idea that we're going to bring people in deep need in and get them into a position where they can do things even our middle class is very much struggling to do. That's pretty high mark that I don't even know if it can be achieved. But if we had a certain number of people we were going to do that for, and as a community, we agreed this is the goal. Let's all lean in and make sure it happens. I think that could give us all like something to look at. And that's just this is just an example.
Right.
This is not, I don't know what the best thing is. And I think those in charge of these resources probably know what this would really look like. But economically, that split you're talking about is the money's going one way.
Yeah.
More and more people buying more and more expensive homes, those in the middle under greater strain, and those in need not really being able to level up because there's no rungs on the ladder for them to climb. Like, what do we, what can we do as a recovery town that wants to help others?
Okay, so
right?
I'm going to cut you off there only because we have to hear from some underwriters. However, I'm going to throw a devil's advocate question out.
Yes.
When VY was closing, Sevids and the BDCC did a lot around economic development. And one thing they talked about is building off of your assets. And so I'm going to sound horribly capitalist and say, well, what if we made, as a recovery town, made it an economic development strategy?
Yeah.
So ponder that little bit of capitalism. I can hear the gasps all over Windham County. Like, really? How dare you?
I can. Think so?
I can.
I don't know how you leave the money out of it. All right, guys.
So hang tight. Leah and I will be back after we hear from some underwriters.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and if you're just joining me, I'm speaking with Leah McGrath Goodman, and we're talking about data and need and social services and a lot of very deep community parts of our deep community fabric. Before we dive back into the conversation, I just want to say thank you to BCTV for taking the video version of this show and sharing it with other stations and media centers around Vermont. And since my lovely regular contributor, Emily Kornheiser, couldn't be here today, it falls to me to say the views and opinions of everyone on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests, and nobody else. Not their house pets, not the platforms, not their employers, not their fill in the blanks. It's just us. So Leah, in the first half of the show, we were talking about a presentation around police interactions and police work within the town of Brattleboro by the Criminal Research Group that happened on August 20th. And I think where we want to segue is, this data is wonderful, but what does that mean for the community? And how do we move forward? And you and I, in many conversations, have talked about the Vermont economy because you are a financial journalist. And I'm fascinated by economics because to me, economics are actually people and the choices people are making and choices communities are making. And what does that mean? And I was horribly capitalist and said, well, what if we made being a recovery town or a caring town in Brattleboro an economic development strategy? But I think where I want to go next is just, let's talk, need is created by many things. People have traumatic experiences, which can really rattle their ability to care for themselves. They can have a physical limitation that might change what work they can or cannot do. They could just be doing a lot of family care, which limits the paid work they can do. They're working. If you are caring for family, you are working. You're just maybe not getting paid for it. So need can be created in many ways, but a lot of it, I think, would boil down to lack of resources. Whether that's time, social capital, or financial capital. And you and I have talked about, one thing I find so fascinating about Vermont in general, but definitely the Brattleboro community, is a large part of our population, according to the last data I've seen, maybe it's changed, COVID and everything, doesn't rely on the local economy for its paycheck. It's either high enough on the economic run that it is living off people are living off a trust or retirement funds or something, but they have money coming in
Yeah.
from outside the economy,
Mhm.
or unfortunately,
Outside the local economy.
the local
Yeah.
economy, yeah. Or unfortunately, they're struggling so much that they are on like social services or something,
Yeah.
which again is not necessarily directly from the local economy funding.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. It's
they're
public
being
money.
served by local nonprofits, which of course are part of the economy, but they're not relying on like a paycheck from the local mom and pop store.
Mhm.
Their funding is coming from elsewhere. And you have often talked about your concern around the middle class
Yeah.
in Vermont in general, but Brattleboro specifically. So I'd love to hear you share with listeners some of your concerns around middle class and what that might the knock-on effects of what that might mean for
Yeah.
social services and people who need help.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective as someone who looks at the economic models underpinning towns and also where they're trending,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of what's happening right now is the economics are making a lot of decisions for us. It is
Hmm.
economics is about people because ultimately we do have to make decisions based on what we can afford, what job is right for us, where we can live, what we can pay for, what our costs are every month. Uh, Unfortunately, we're seeing a housing situation that is disconnected from the job situation of this area.
Right.
And then we also are seeing this increase in need, especially because post pandemic, a lot of the housing we were doing for homeless the funding is starting to run out. So we have more homeless people who need help as well. And we don't have enough affordable housing for them. And when we try to define what is affordable and we look at what jobs are paying in Vermont, that's also a pretty serious issue because the jobs just aren't paying something that would allow you to reasonably maintain a home, raise a family, or care for your family or extended family or anyone in your household,
Mm-hmm.
plus save for retirement. And if you can't like achieve that middle class sort of meat in the sandwich, things start to destabilize. And what we're seeing is a lot more people coming in who are independent of needing to do a paycheck to paycheck type job, right?
Right.
They're living off of investment income. Maybe they're even living off of rental income of other real estate they own.
Good point.
There's a
Yeah.
lot of people who do that. Some are just retired and they have a pension, but we're seeing increasingly people taking up a lot of the more affordable or unaffordable, but they can pay for it stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have this middle piece that's getting really eroded. And then you raise the question of if we want to be a recovery town, do we have an economic model to support doing that? So it's not just about this kind of race to the bottom where we need to keep raising taxes and raising money and also getting bigger and bigger grants to handle the larger and larger need.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Well, and
I
I
bring up the
would
middle class. Let me finish.
sure.
I bring up the middle class because without a middle class, you're never going to get to do any of these things. And if we don't care about that, we're already done, is
Right.
my point. We're done and it's game over already. I'm worried that what I'm seeing is the game ending before our eyes because I don't see enough effort going towards supporting the middle class in this area.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of interest in being mad about those with more and mad about those with less. And that isn't where we want to be.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Sorry.
Oh no,
I was
you're
like, I
fine.
want to close the loop on that one.
No, no problem. What I was going to add was, especially to me, when I think of like having an economic development strategy, and you
Yes.
mentioned race to the bottom.
Yes.
How do we get out of crisis? And how do we have enough strategy, planning, and ultimately resources to
Yes.
move from crisis response to a proactive response?
Yes.
And I think a lot of, to touch on what you said about the eroding middle class, I would agree. When when I am interviewing people for articles and they talk about the workforce shortage, for example,
Yeah.
I say, well, talk to me about what the shortage looks like. Is it that not enough people are applying for jobs?
Mhm.
they're applying for the jobs, and then they see what it pays and they're like, I can't afford, I can't live on that.
Yeah.
Is it they don't have the skills for the job? What does that look like? And
Yeah.
I'll ask employers. And I think one mistake we make around discussing the economy, at least in this area, is we look at all jobs as equal.
Mhm.
And you know, as someone who grew up in the Deerfield Valley, heavy tourism industry,
Yeah.
um, there's a lot of good jobs there, but they don't always really pay.
You can't build a middle class lifestyle like we just defined it with that kind of a seasonal job or even a tourism job,
Mhm.
usually.
Usually.
Some people, I mean, we all know exceptions. The
Mhm.
person who worked from the bottom on the way up and then somehow became a co-owner of their own
Right.
place or their own restaurant, or maybe the owner decided to like bring them in as a partner. Like there are stories, but we know we all tell them because they are exceptions. That's
Yeah.
why they're noteworthy. But what you're talking about, I mean, I think the thing is we're in a, I call it the death loop, and that's scary
Mm.
because once you have a death loop, it's an eddy, and you know what an eddy
Oh yeah, you
does.
just keep
It starts
circling.
sucking everything in, and our death loop here, and it starts with the housing piece, but it doesn't end there. The death loop is very much housing to make new housing costs more than what the job market here can support. And
Right.
so people aren't incentivized to build because they can't get the rent that would support that building.
Mhm.
And that's not just to cover the building. These people aren't looking to break even when they build. They're looking to make some level of profit because they still have to put time into it and they have to risk their own money. And
Mhm.
so to build, you need people who can pay for whatever that housing may be.
Right.
And if they can't, then they can't be here to take a job. And if they can't be here to take a job and that job isn't paying enough anyway for them to pay for that housing, then what happens is a jobs start to go to another state. You know, we've
Mhm.
seen a lot of companies leave Brattleboro and go to somewhere else where they think the housing's more affordable and what they want to pay can allow them to level up and the people they're
Hmm.
hiring to level up. So the death loop is too expensive housing, too expensive to build, not enough of a job salary situation to support being in these sorts of housing opportunities. And then the employer is saying, wow, for what we want to pay, we can't get what we need. And the employees are saying, for what you're paying, I can't get what I need.
Mhm.
And so everything starts to kind of pull away at that point because you got this like death loop of
Yeah.
each thing reinforces the other thing, but not in a good way. It's like, it's the opposite of a virtuous circle, it's a vicious cycle. And we need to get back to virtuous circles, which is kind of why we're talking about this today. We're talking about how do other communities solve these problems,
Mhm.
and can Brattleboro do it, or is our focus such that we are not interested in those solutions? Which I suspect there's some of that going on as well.
Hmm.
Because you do
Mhm.
have to care about the numbers, and the numbers mean money, and money means caring about things that some people around here are not as interested in. But if we're not going to have that economic model that supports our goals,
Mhm.
then our goals will eventually, we'll lose our own goals by not caring about what's underpinning them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I often feel that Vermont is in sort of a funny situation that it has done a very good job of not only being a beautiful state with
Yes.
wonderful communities, but marketing itself as
Yes.
that beautiful state with wonderful communities. And I worry that sometimes we get so caught up in what I call protecting the postcard, that
Mhm.
idyllic image of what we want Vermont to be or why we moved to Vermont or anything like that.
Yeah.
Um, that we don't step back and say, well, what does it actually take to, at a very structural level, protect that postcard
Yeah.
and or support the people trying to live in that postcard? And I don't know that I think there's sometimes a disconnect there.
Right. Right.
And I think that's one of the things that hasn't helped um, the middle class. As you're talking, two things stand out to me. from conversations I've had with Stephanie Yu from the Public Assets Institute in Montpelier.
Right.
Also really great reports. Check out their website. And she has said two things over time about Vermont and our economy that speak to me on a very structural level. One is, compared to our New England neighbors, our wages are pretty bad. And that our cost of living, when you compare us to our neighbors, our New England neighbors, so Maine, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont. Cost of living, we tend to sit in the middle of the pack. We're not the most expensive, we're not the least expensive.
Yeah.
But wage-wise, we tend to sit near the bottom of the pack. We're like one or two from the bottom.
Right. And then we have a tax burden that is, I would say, pretty outrageous compared to what other states offer and other towns offer.
Right. You're not the only one to say that.
Yeah.
But the other thing that Stephanie has said that stands out to me is this: as a state, particularly the state, we have been underinvesting in our systems for years. So
what's our systems mean in that context?
Infrastructure, state departments, like staffing levels, resources for people to actually get their jobs done.
Okay.
Like across the board, the state for about 20 years has been underinvesting in itself. Which brings me back to what you were saying about the middle class. That puts, in my opinion, it puts more burden on folks who are trying to earn from the local economy. But it also means that the folks who are trying to help the people in need may, at a very structural level, not be getting the resources they need to do what they need.
Yes.
And to me, that just feels like goes back to what you said about the vicious cycle, as if we're underinvesting, our wages are low, like where are the resources actually coming from to do what we would need to do?
I mean, I don't want to scare anyone, but I'm going to paint this in really like stark terms.
And I'd also love to hear about some of the other communities you've
oh no, we're going to move on to that in a second. And I actually am just going to sort of give you like the bullets on what they focus on.
Perfect.
So people can get that and maybe think about it. But to put it in stark terms, if we don't focus on economic engines that can support our aspirations, what will happen effectively is those who are earning more, who can afford a second home in Vermont or just want to move here with their own money, are going to increasingly be the bigger and bigger share. And I've even seen people up north. If you go to Reddit and you type Vermont housing and you look at all the different threads, you will see some people, especially up north in the Burlington and Chittenden County areas, and even up toward Montpelier, saying things like, the strategy is to bring all the people with money in and to not care about any middle class. That is the strategy. The state has no problem with that, and they're just going to keep pushing it. And I was like, well, I don't know if I haven't heard anyone say that. I don't think,
that sounds really bleak.
Like, I don't think traditional Vermonters want to believe that we don't want locals to feel supported who have made their lives here, who want to build their families here, or newcomers who also have to live paycheck to paycheck, but also want to build a life here. And, helping people in need is a piece of that, but we can't just abandon all the other parts of our community. We need to have a balance. And that's what healthy communities will do. They'll acknowledge that different balances are needed to achieve these goals. I think, bleakly speaking, what I'm seeing and what I've seen over the last decade is more and more people who have their own money from somewhere else coming in, grabbing a home that people here can't afford, and then either making a life here or kind of keeping their foot here and then somewhere else where they're earning more. And I mean, that's where the trend is going, guys. I'm sorry. It's where, again, if I'm wrong, if somebody thinks that I'm way off, please let me know. But at least in where I've been in Brattleboro and in Southern Vermont, I don't see what I would call the rise in the middle class. I would say I see the rise of an affluent class and those in deep need. I've seen those rise. But what I want to see is a rise of the middle. And filling in that missing middle is where, if we did do that, we could reverse this trend. Because when you have that missing middle, it helps pull those below up.
Right.
And it also is supportive to those above because, it's a more thriving community. There's also a lot more exchange of different services and goods when you have people offering things and then people buying things. But if you have that missing middle, then there's less to buy because there's less support in your shops, in your restaurants, in your even in your ski areas. Or if somebody starts a business here, who's going to buy? It can't be the people who can't afford it. It's going to have to be the people who have some more money.
Right.
So it really, that missing middle it throws off everything into this. It gets you out of that vicious cycle and into the virtuous circle because more families buy more, they work more, they eat more. And if you're a retired person and you're not eating as much as a family, you're not going out often as much as, and even if you do, you won't eat as much and you won't buy as much. And so the middle class is like essential because they're the ones who are deeply engaged in the economy, in the schools, in buying and working. So they're offering a lot and they're also consuming a lot, quite frankly. If anybody's had like 3 boys in their family, look at your grocery bill. And the engagement with the economy is sort of off the charts in the middle. And it's not the same above or below.
Right.
You might have somebody with a lot of money buying an expensive watch, but again, it's not the same as what a family will contribute to the economy. And so at the end of the day, we want that missing middle. And we're going to talk just briefly. I'm going to let you ask me some questions about that. But if we do focus on the missing middle, a lot of these problems will increasingly be solved and the tax base will grow too. We'll have more money to devote to more of these people who are in need.
That's one of my concerns. We only have a few more minutes left. I'll just say this quickly. That's one of my concerns about our tax system, especially around tourism, is when you look at the taxes that something like a ski area generates.
Yeah.
Everything from what the ski area itself generates to the meals, the rooms, the local option tax, all those things. It looks like a lot, and it is a lot. Like we get a lot of tax money from our tourist industry, but I sometimes worry that that amount of tax money creates a lot of shadow or obliterates the rest of the economy. Like you can't really see what the rest of the economy is doing because from a tax level, you're like, oh, look at all this tax money that's coming in. We're great.
Yeah.
And we're not really seeing everything else that's playing out in the economy.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of arguments to be made for certain parts of our economy being really captured by certain parts of what we are doing, right? Like I would argue tourism is a part of our lives and it's always going to be an important part of our economy as long as people want to come to Vermont. And, as much as Vermonters sometimes take for granted how this place feels to people who aren't from here, people are just going to always come here wanting to experience the beauty and majesty and outdoors of Vermont. And so there's always going to be that part of the tax base as long as we are a desired place. I would also say, a lot of jobs are powered by, as you said, the recovery economy or the health economy. So we have a lot of that as well. That includes social services, a lot of jobs supported through social services we're offering.
Nonprofits in general are a huge part of Vermont's economy.
Nonprofits are massive. And what we need to remember is nonprofits don't pay taxes. They are actually tax shelters. And so the more nonprofits we have occupying space and asking for things like extra police services and things like that, we may not have the same opportunities to do other sorts of things in the economy, like having startups or having, new businesses that are going to be supported. And so there's only so much space and money for everything. And so the balance is what it's all about. And I'm just going to quickly run through in the middle class communities where a community went all the way to the bottom and there was almost nothing left. I study these communities. What happens? What happens is they fight all the way to the bottom. There's constant fights in these communities where eventually they have to start over. They have to literally say, we didn't get there and now everybody's moved out and we are overrun with people in need to the point where we need to start all over again.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the towns I studied that I'm going to mention here, because we don't have a lot more time, it's
Yeah.
Ogden, Utah. Ogden, Ogden, Utah. They had that happen. People actually just left. The town was like a ghost town at one point. And I went in and looked at what they did. And here are the few things that they did that revived the town.
Mm.
They took the little bit of tax money they were still getting, and they funded 5 to 10 new startups a year.
Mm.
They gave them somewhere between like $15,000 and $20,000. They would have people write business plans. They'd fund a handful a year, and some failed and some succeeded. And I asked the man after 10 years of doing this, the head of economic development, if he could tell which businesses were going to make it and which ones wouldn't. He said, I still have no idea. I'm still amazed at the ones that make it and the ones that don't. He said a pot smoking couple started a pizza joint and now it's huge, huge. And he said, they have all these additional buildings now and they did great. He said, you never know. But if you fund a certain amount every year, what they do is every time the businesses do well, they take the tax money that they're generating with whatever sales they're doing or goods and services, and they put it back into the fund to fund the next round of startups.
Gotcha.
Most economic growth comes from businesses with 5 staff or less. That's where the top growth comes from in this country, across the country. So funding startups is essential. And the town repopulated its town with businesses, little businesses that were run by locals largely. And in addition, they did a lot of public-private partnerships with builders and also with places that they could bring businesses in, make deals with places who would bring their businesses into the town, and the town would try to find ways to support it. And that also generated jobs, and then it generated tax money, and it built the town. They also obsessed over their downtown. They made their downtown a sacred nexus. No empty storefronts. They always found a way to get that storefront filled. They had an events coordinator, so the downtown had events going all year round. They just had one person doing it, but they had up to 500 events a year at one point.
Wow.
They made the downtown very walkable, very bikeable. We're already doing that. Just like us, they were on a river. They had mountains nearby. They really leaned in. They have now a ton of different companies that have come in that offer like bikes and outdoor stuff and ski equipment. And they've also brought in a couple government groups. So I think there's a huge group there that provides IRS and tax services. That's actually a branch of the US government, but they brought them in. They brought a ton of jobs too. Housing, they focused 100% on middle class housing almost only. And what they do is they build a certain amount of middle class housing. The town actually runs it and does public private partnerships with builders. And what they do is they make sure the housing is very appealing but affordable for a middle class job in that town. So you can work in the town at like Dick's Sporting Goods and still buy a house and still raise your family. And they also went out of their way to make sure that those places that were really not great, the head of economic development said, a lot of people are renting out these awful places and just adding a little paint and then charging just below the market rate. And then these poor people who are in need can barely afford it. And they're not even getting a good place. He watches those places like a hawk, and he gets the town to buy them. Now, we have a Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust that does stuff like that.
Right.
But he would also have the town buy up things and then refurbish and starts renting out to those who needed it or to the middle class. And now they have all these families filling up the schools, engaging the economy, walking around downtown and buying stuff all the time. All the restaurants are hopping. And he also said, helping those in need, that the main thing that they do is a lot of partnerships with surrounding towns and communities and states so that the town can carry a certain amount of people. But if it's getting really hard, they can start tapping into other areas as part of the spokes in the wheel to try to get a balance between them and neighboring towns and other places. And he said it is the biggest challenge. He said the biggest challenge is, what do we do with people in deep need? How do we help them? And he said the fact is we can accept a certain amount where we can really help them. And then after that, we have to work with other communities to see if they can help us too. And those are the main takeaways that revived the town. And over a decade, the town went from really bottomed out to thriving. And he said it does take time and you have to be patient, but it works. So that is kind of the middle class revival plan in a nutshell.
Okay, well, thank you, Leah McGrath Goodman. Unfortunately, we are out of time here on the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I know we probably raised as many questions
I know.
as we answered.
Sorry, guys, please send your questions because we're also learning as we go. We know that we only have so much information. I'm sure a lot of people listening have a lot of additional things they could add that would help. But it's a puzzle. It's ultimately a puzzle, and it's a puzzle where we might all have pieces that we can share.
And thank you for that. Thank you, Leah, for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
The Montpelier Happy Hour will return next Friday on the radio station at 2 p.m., rebroadcasted every Wednesday morning, and wherever you find your podcasts, and of course, BCTV. So take care, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Bye.